Thank you very much, David.
Right. Well, I agree with a lot of what Ed says, actually. Whether I'd agree with what he'd do remains to be seen. My feeling is that the BBC is a tremendously precious institution, and it's unique, and no other country has it, and the greatest advocates of the BBC are often people who watch television abroad. And I think if it weren't there, it would be tremendously missed, and I'm sure Ed agrees with that and said so. The question is, how do we protect it? Because it's been under a tremendous amount of attack recently from rival media and from politicians. And it's very easy to attack the BBC because it's a large institution, it has many warring factions within it, it provides a lot of services, and many of the services it provides, some of the people who enjoy its other services don't like. I mean, that's, I think, one of the strange things about the BBC is a lot of opponents of the licence fee think their licence fee goes towards whatever it is they hate about the BBC and not the things they like. So the people who hate Jonathan Ross think that's all their money is going towards, while they'll happily enjoy, you know, the Archers and Songs of Praise. Meanwhile, you know, 20-somethings who love Jonathan Ross think, why are they wasting all that money on boring documentaries? The point you have to ask yourself, as someone who uses the BBC services, is the licence fee overall a reasonable amount to pay for what you get? And I think it's a very reasonable amount to pay for what you get. I mean, it's less than buying a daily newspaper every day, and it provides, you know, loads of radio stations, loads of TV stations, a terrific website, etc. But nevertheless, you can look at the licence fee, which is much criticised by enemies of the corporation and by some people who call themselves friends of the corporation, is on the face of it an unfair way to pay for something. Everyone pays the same. It would be nice if it was more, you know, means tested. It would be fairer if it came out of income tax. But if it came out of income tax, the BBC would have no independence in its funding. It would be up for, its whole existence would be up for renewal at every budget. So that's a thing that's easy to attack, but is vital to its survival. Similarly, it's supposed to be impartial, and yet it's supposed to be politically independent, yet it's supposed to be accountable. How do you represent its accountability other than listening to politicians, and yet politicians are the very people the BBC shouldn't have to listen to? So again, that's an area where the BBC is very easy to attack. It's supposed to not hamper commercial competitors and allow the market to continue, you know, in a way that isn't too limited by the BBC's existence. But at the same time, if all it did was the shipping forecast and the proms, people would soon start to resent the money they pay for it. So it has to do popular shows, then it gets criticised if the shows are too popular, and it gets criticised if the shows aren't popular enough. So it's basically a disastrous institution to try and defend. Yet I think most people think, and I deeply believe, that we are much the richer for its existence. And we could very easily chip away at it in a well-meaning way, change the way it's governed, change the trust, which, you know, as Ed points out, the trust is supposed to decide what it does, it's supposed to police it, but it's part of it. But at the same time, if you replace that with an institution that isn't part of it, well, who appoints the members of that, if not politicians? Maybe they could be randomly appointed by jury service. I don't know. But yes, but essentially it's very difficult to scrutinise this institution that, if it is wrongly scrutinised, will lose its independence. And I think if you start changing small things like that, you can very easily get to the point where it is fundamentally weakened and it will fail. And I think that would be a huge loss to this country, and I think the rest of the world would look on in disbelief that the British, you know, who have done so many good things and so many stupid things, have finally capped it all with an act of wanton stupidity, destroying one of the few institutions that we still have a genuine reason to be proud of. So I know in saying that, I'm almost framing an argument for not scrutinising or changing anything about the BBC ever, and I know that's unreasonable. But at the same time, I just think we have to be very careful, and obviously the BBC is, to a certain extent, scrutinised. You only have to open the Daily Mail to see that. So I also, I suppose, take slight issue with the title of the debate, What's the BBC For? Because I think it's a kind of dangerous question to be asking. I think the big question we have to ask is, are we glad the BBC exists? And how can we make sure that it survives? And that's never been more important than it is now, because the other media are in trouble, and obviously the BBC's existence doesn't always help that. But the main reason the established newspapers, other TV channels are in trouble is because of the change into new media, is because of the internet. That's not something the BBC's done. It's something the BBC has embraced rather impressively, but it's not been caused by the BBC. The change has come with technology, not with the existence of a public service broadcaster. And thanks to our public service broadcaster, our television media and our internet news aren't as hugely threatened and hugely impoverished as they are in countries which don't have the benefit of the existence of an institution like the BBC. So I think the BBC's existence has never been more important, but ironically, it has never been more under threat. And I think most of the people who speak against the BBC or for change in the BBC essentially have other interests. And I know that Ed makes a fair point that he's been accused, and the Conservatives have been accused many times of siding with Murdoch where their views have differed from Murdoch. But nevertheless, very publicly, the Sun newspaper changed its political support during the Labour Party conference. That was a very definite, very deliberate thing, and I think you would think less of the British public if that didn't make them suspicious about some sort of relationship or some sort of conversation that has gone on between the Conservative Party and Rupert Murdoch. And that means we have to scrutinise things that the Tories say about the media much more carefully than we otherwise would. That doesn't mean to say you're necessarily acting in Murdoch's interest at all, but we have to be very careful to make sure that you aren't. Yes, absolutely.
What I'm always intrigued by this. What did the Labour government do in return for the support of the Sun newspaper over the last 13 years to the BBC?
Well, maybe they forced the resignation of the former Director General. I mean, I don't think the Labour Party's record in terms of supporting the BBC is very good either. And in general, I think politicians don't often have the BBC's best interests at heart, or certainly that's not their number one priority. And that's one of the very important reasons, as you said, for the BBC to remain independent of politicians. But I'd be interested to know how your proposal to replace the trust will make sure that the people scrutinising the BBC aren't politically influenced.
Well, the point about the trust is, as I said, it does two things. One, it's an advocate for the BBC, it's a cheerleader. And the other thing it's meant to do is to regulate the BBC and to test out whether, for example, new services that the BBC launches have an impact, and we think those are fundamentally in conflict. I do think that, the BBC Trust was set up as a result of the massive row that the Labour government had with the BBC over the Gilligan report and everything that came out of that, and it was decided then in Parliament that the governors of the BBC were too close to the BBC and there needed to be a little distance from the BBC. But we at the time opposed the creation of the BBC Trust because we felt it still carried that essential conflict of interest. There's nothing wrong with the Director General and the Chairman of the BBC, if there was a separate Chairman of the BBC, defending the BBC to the hilt, fighting for it and advocating it. And I would say, by the way, that the kind of image portrayed perhaps by some of David's remarks that the BBC is sort of cowering in the corner while politicians take turns to come up and give it a good kicking is, I think, quite far from the truth. I mean, the BBC is very, very capable of looking after itself and putting forward the arguments that it needs to put forward. So the fact that we want a separate regulator, I mean, all I can tell you is that, I suspect that, the Sun and the News of the World decided to back the Conservatives because they had dealings with the Conservatives and talked to David Cameron and decided he's the best person. Every newspaper is entitled to support which political party it wants to support. I don't think the Sun, or to put it bluntly, I don't think the Sun got anything particularly out of the Labour government or News International or Rupert Murdoch. I think the fight over the BBC that resulted in the Hutton report was all about, Alistair Campbell versus the BBC, a kind of row that got absurdly out of control and hurt a great many people. So, I can tell you that I don't get lobbied particularly by Sky, I don't get lobbied by News International. I've come to these conclusions, Jeremy Hunt and I have come to these views about how you should reflect on media policy from having a range of conversations with every single other media organisation, which includes ITV, it includes Channel 4, it includes the Guardian media group. And as I say, I think the changes we propose are rather modest. But there's no question that we want to see the BBC thrive and survive. The only issue, as far as we're concerned with the BBC, is the impact it has on competitors who want to have the space to develop their organisation.